Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest installment of the AVERT webinar series. My name is Lydia Khalil. I am the convener of the AVERT Research Network, and I'd like to begin this morning, as we traditionally do, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. For me, it's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'm really excited today for our speaker, Mr. Jade Hutchinson. Before I welcome Jade and talk and introduce his presentation, just a few housekeeping matters. We'll start the session today with Jade's presentation, and then afterwards there'll be time for Q&A for Jade. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, the Q&A function. And after which we'll moderate those questions from all of the ones that were put into the Q&A function. So let me begin by introducing Jade Hutchinson. Mr. Hutchinson is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University. His research is focused on countering far-right extremism and violence emerging from digital media ecosystems. He examines the relationship between ideological and conspiratorial beliefs, and also how socio-technical systems interact. His current research is concentrated on the ways that social media hardware devices and software design shapes far-right extremist dispositions, as well as their engagement in extremist violence in both the Australian and Canadian context. So for today, Jade is going to be talking to us about his research, the far-right online ecosystem, how a network of platforms and devices shape far-right violent extremism, where he'll talk about the benefits and limits of drawing on ecology to understand online violent extremism. Jade, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us for this AVERT webinar. I'll hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'll share my slides with you all. Great. I hope you can all see the slides with me.
Yes, all good.
Great. All right. So again, thank you, Nell and Lydia, and to the wider AVERT network for the invitation and for hosting this occasion to speak with you all. As mentioned, I really want to dig into some recent collaborative research that sought to critically assess and improve the use of ecology when trying to understand and hopefully address online extremism and violence. This presentation will have a general arc moving from more conceptual to more practical. And if there's anything about what I say regarding the history or theory related to ecosystems, more than happy to address or elaborate on that during question time. I do think it is important, though, to provide some historical and theoretical context for why we're talking about ecosystems at all. And I actually find it quite interesting that it is through Freudian psychology that ecologists originally found the opportunity to apply ecosystems to humans and societies. So in the late 1800s, this person here portrayed in portrait, Sir Arthur George Tainsley, attempted and then failed to establish ecology as a respectable or accepted discipline at Oxford University. And despite his best efforts to establish ecology on his own campus, Tainsley observed how ecosystems and the ecological approach was taking shape and becoming quite popular in areas outside of Oxford and also outside of plant studies or botany. Writing in 1904, ecology may now be considered an almost fashionable study. Being Sigmund Freud's mentee, Tainsley later synthesized his supervisor's research in psychology and sought to turn the concept of ecosystems inward. He wrote a book about a decade later, whom Freud, unsurprisingly, wrote a a quite charitable review for, where Tainsley then applied ecosystems to arguably the most controversial aspects of social life at the time. I'm sure they're not anymore, God and sex, where he originally tried to, and quite aggressively, pursue ecosystems thinking in the way that we understand human psychology and behavior. He essentially thought of the human mind as being composed and organized of these interconnected circuits, right? It's very much about how stimulus response mechanisms were pushing around psychic flows of energy. And this resembles the time in which he was writing, right? It's very industrial, steam-based analogies to further explain his supervisor's research. I think today it's more so referred to as the hydraulic theory of emotion. At the time, though, Tainsley thought that these analogies were an illogical and contradictory procedure, and they functionally serve to simply reduce the bewildering complexity of mental phenomena to something like order. In a publication later that year, Tainsley further imposed this way of thinking about human nature, suggesting that humans, like all other organisms, may be or should be regarded as machines, transforming energy from one form to another. Viewed like a machine and when applied to natural environments, Tainsley here, he eventually and successfully advocated for ecology in human psychology. However, that same approach was also used for the organization of colonies that were said to reveal economic properties that could be mapped and managed by his employer, British Empire. Nearly 120 years later, ecology continues to be, as I would argue, a fashionable study. Ecological concepts continue to accrue popularity, and they do continue to be turned inward. We are now using ecosystems to progressively map and manage security threats within the digital media environment. I recently wanted to understand, what was the trajectory of popularity among terms like far right and digital ecosystems. And as you can see from the slides in front of you, their popularity has risen quite dramatically in recent decades. I wonder whether the convergence of these two may just be a coincidence. It's their mutual importance and how we think about the relationship between humans and technology today, or whether ecosystems really can help us better understand how a network of technology comes to shape extremism and how violence emerges from these digital media environments. However, there are important considerations to be made when drawing insights from ecology to help us to better understand this phenomena while avoid portraying reality, you might say. A good friend and evolutionary biologist once said to me, every metaphor must endure eternal vigilance. And like others before it, extremism and terrorism studies are beginning to turn to ecology to better understand this dynamic and this fleeting yet interrelated and somehow self-reinforcing nature of online extremism. And increasingly and much more recent is the ways in which ecology can help design or at least inform management strategies to help avoid the worst consequences of online extremism. So when translated into our field of interest, ecosystems was quickly and perhaps predictably rendered into in-group and out-group terminology. So this meant seeing newly labeled ecosystems like the far-right ecosystem, or as we'll speak about in this presentation, the incel ecosystem. These seem to constitute yet again another new center of radicalization. And such ecosystems, it was supposed, could be crucially conditioning the way that violent extremists enculture their identity or their sense of purpose or the way they provide themselves or their community with justifications for violence. And this seems true, of course. There are complex and networked ways in which digital technologies are increasingly handing over to these communities the tools to contribute to a more transnational perspective or to recruit across a wider audience, you might say. And okay, sure, ecosystems in this way does feel intuitively true and important. But to someone who is inexperienced in the biological sciences, or I now know, to someone who has predicated their career on the biological sciences, this can sound somewhat superficial to explain how and why why extremism and violence may emerge from these environments. Indeed, and something I think that we all recognize in these ecosystem metaphors is this general top layer, that is starting to become composed with ideas and beliefs, and the way this has a top-down overlay over human psychology and behavior. But if we primarily focus on this layer, on this ideas and the ways that beliefs can come to characterize violent extremism, the ecosystem simply serves as another placeholder for ideology, and a question may arise about how much progress has been made using ecosystems in this way. And okay, sure. I mean, most violent extremists today, as we all are profoundly interconnected and increasingly intertwined with social networking technologies, and it does provide them with access to outcomes that were previously unattainable or inaccessible. So then why do we focus so little until so recently on what digital ecosystems actually are, right? What kind of vocabulary can we use to interrogate these ecosystems, to better understand them and perhaps even intervene in them? What are the advantages and limitations of using these kinds of concepts to approach this problem? Unsure how to answer any of these questions myself, I wanted to see how others had answered them. So I conducted a multidisciplinary literature review, and I tried to get in conversation with as many ecologists and evolutionary biologists as I could to first understand what it is that they mean by terms like ecology, ecosystems, and the ecological approach. And to them, ecology is generally considered to be a method of scientific inquiry, right? But specifically, it is a classification system. It can encompass a existing as well as emerging networks of biological and non-biological things, as well as their interaction and consequences for their development. An approach would encompass these interactions but increase the scale by which you try to understand their interaction. So it's not just about how someone interacts with their phone, so to speak, but also what are the developmental consequences of that interaction for components that are intrinsic to the individual or vital to the individual. And then going in the opposite direction, how does this interaction have consequences for how they are in different populations of extremists, or how they think of themselves in the community, or in what ways does this entire ecosystem have consequences for that interaction, right? So it's really quite elastic in how it thinks about the systematic relationship between individuals and the environments that they inhabit. Generally speaking, there are three major approaches to ecosystems. One considers the organism to be the focus of the ecosystem. So what's their role? What's their function? Another considers the ecosystem to be a set of processes that generally focuses on the flow of matter or energy, right? What is the course by which certain calories make their way through an environment when a bear ingests a bilberry, for instance? This is where we get the term food chains from, and translated into extremism and terrorism studies, it might be the way that ideology moves through digital media environments. The third approach, and this seems to be the most popular at the moment, is viewing the ecosystem as a series of distinct geographies, right? There are physical environments, and each of them exert a kind of pressure on the person that inhabits them. I do want to note, though, that there have been some, publications that appeal to this approach, right? Seeing the ecosystem as a set of geographies, and often the justification of which is based on, a misquotation, unfortunately, of Tainsley's original works, where they viewed Tainsley's work as saying that the emphasis should really be placed on the spatial environment. But the misquotation is that this is a screenshot of Tainsley's writings. He actually said the emphasis is placed on the special environment. So this is the emphasis placed on the organism more so than the environment itself, which I think is quite telling. So now moving a little bit closer to the practical side of things, we now look at the basic functions, right? What do you get from using ecology in a theoretical way? So ecology offers, as I said, a system of classification. This enables you to name and label, to identify and describe different systems and networks and settings in which things take place. Ecology, it also cultures a kind of holistic perspective, a way of trying to think about the whole series of systems that come together and have kind of dependencies on one another, right? And yet it also encourages us to think in a very precise and mechanistic way about how these things come together. It also fundamentally supports investigations into the settings and how those settings come to characterize the experiences of which the people in those settings have. And based on these observations, ecologists are and will continue to devise various management strategies in order to conserve or to remove or repress certain conditions that are considered to be unhealthy or sustainable. So following this general overview of the literature, how do other people perceive terms in ecology, I wanted to understand what are the conceptual building blocks here. And through this research, myself and others came up with a series of concepts or characteristics of ecosystems. And this illustration in front of you now, it does break down ecosystems in useful ways. It enables us to take one or another concept and think critically about how that's represented in the problem that we're looking at, or if this particular concept does seem to be evidence of the process or a consequence that we would rather avoid, how can we develop a management strategy to address that concept? It's important to note here that this is not a definitive list, and I know of other concepts that are still important to ecosystems, but not listed here or are in some ways encompassed in another concept. And another thing to note is the value of an ecosystem framework really comes from trying to bring together as many of these concepts as you can, right? Trying to use multiple concepts like using network, dynamism, and classification together to give you a more accurate and detailed picture of what it means to be in that ecosystem, both as an individual, as a collective. Right. Again, stepping further towards the pragmatic side of this presentation, I just want to give an example of a piece of research that was conducted using this kind of ecological thinking. And I know that the title of the presentation is Far Right Online Ecosystems, and I was intending on giving an example of a publication where it was based in a far right community, but this is a more recent piece of research, and I think it might provide a clearer example of the above. So this piece of research sought to understand what is the presence and the influence of software and hardware within a incel community, specifically incel.is. It's a website forum where people sympathetic to the incel worldview or who seem to experience grievances or identity traits like those related to incel ideology, they can come there and discuss their personal histories and pontificate, what it would mean to see themselves in the world through the lens of their ideology. And for this project, we wanted to determine what is the prevalence and the association between these different types of technology within their everyday life. And here we focused on the practices and the systems and the settings in which incels would refer to these technologies, and how did it come to shape their expression of ideology, let's say. Just quickly, the data itself was sourced from the Cambridge University Cybercrime Center. I encourage anyone to reach out to them. Richard and the team there were great in facilitating our access to that. And the time frame for analysis, the time in which the data represents, is from November 2017 until December 2021. And we focused on the top 10% of those posts within the website forum. And this gave us a working sample of over 2.1 million posts. And this was over 35% of all posts on the website during this time. For any of those interested, we used a natural language text-based analysis. So this was frequency distribution and word collocation. In essence, this means we wanted to understand the most popular words used. And when you narrowed down on any one of those words, how were they used in context? So for the word frequency, we wanted to know what words were mentioned more than 1,000 times. And they were Tinder, Reddit, phone, as in mobile phone, Discord, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, incels.co, screen, as in your mobile phone screen, and 4chan. And when we burrowed down in how these words were used in context, we then wanted to understand from a qualitative point of view, right? How are these terms and the way that they're used, how do they relate to technology and incel identities? Now, how does ecology fit into all this? Ecology essentially helped us overcome a few assumptions, right? We assumed that the technologies that we were viewing were not developed or used in isolation, but rather they were embedded in wider societal frameworks, and they were intertwined and mutually reinforcing the ways that incels were interacting in this space. And this framing is essentially a classification system, right? It helped us to identify, name, and label the prevalence and association between these technologies and the community that we were looking at. In this sense, ecological thinking, it encouraged us to see that these technologies and the incels that were using them were, of course, not separate. They were integral, intimate component parts of a larger system that were each evolving in real time in response to the other. And in this way, we were quite sympathetic to the idea that their coexistence is not mutual, right? These technologies were not necessarily designed or deployed with an incel's well-being in mind, you might say. And I should mention that this study is still in press. However, there are a few findings that I think are worth highlighting. And you'll notice that these findings really stress the centrality of software and hardware in this community and the ways in which their everyday life is expressed through discourse. So among the three main categories that we saw, they were online dating sites, social media platforms, and the hardware used to access these. Among the online dating sites, Tinder was referenced nearly 11,000 times in discussions and represented, as you can see, the vast majority of mentions of when compared to all other online dating sites. So nearly 100% of the time, incels were talking about Tinder relative to other online dating sites. Reddit was mentioned nearly 9,000 times, composing over 35% of all mentions when compared again to other social networking sites like Tinder and, like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and others. What was interesting to see was Reddit, when in context, was often connected to other very specific software features like browser, channel, subreddit, thread, post, and forum. And these all seem to make sense. They are terms that reference other parts of the Reddit platform that users often engage with, but there were also other terms like user, avatar, and algorithm for which the users would often comment on. In regards to hardware, phone was the most popular piece of hardware technology referenced, over 5,000 times, and over 50% of over 50% of the time, phone was mentioned relative to other components of hardware used. And when we looked at the ways that the term phone was used in context, screen was the most popular term used, then computer, and then TV, camera, machine, and server. So as you can see, these technologies offer incels really the opportunity to not just connect with others, but to connect with themselves in unlikely or otherwise unattainable ways. And the software and hardware both contextualizes and makes it possible for individuals to negotiate with each other what meaning can be drawn from their personal histories and from the world around them. How can they gain popularity within this community? How can they reach a comfortable level of recognition? In reference to the dating site Tinder, incel discussions generally revolve the platform's capacity to amplify and even exacerbate stereotypes, distorting the sexual marketplace. And they often argued that this created a sort of unfair distribution in the way that potential partners were allocated with each other. And this supported claims that the incels will champion that platforms like Tinder will allocate potential partners to more attractive, hypermasculine stereotypes, and they call those stereotypes chads. And this disparity endures, they will suggest, because chads can pursue, multiple partners simultaneously, and they can do this through Tinder despite displaying otherwise unattractive personality types, right? Tinder is giving them an unfair advantage, let's say. For instance, one user said to another, even Chad, who is a loner and a loser, can still get laid. References to race appeared frequently, but less so to sexuality. And this seems to make sense generally, right? Incels focus on attractiveness over race. As one user again commented to another, race is a subset of looks. Looks is supreme, not race. And because online dating sites are said to reward chads, incels then discuss strategies on how to surreptitiously pantomime or copy, right, the ways that chads have advantage in this space, right? How do chads have access to multiple women, and how can we replicate that in our own lives? And they call this technique chad fishing. As one user said to another, heck, I could even make a quick Tinder chadfish to confirm my thoughts on hypergamy. So in other ways, this is saying that this digital model, right, the socio-technical systems underlying the community here, it does tend to entrench the inclination for them to not just view, but to appraise themselves from the outside looking in. And this, I would argue, is well represented in the disconcerting frequency with which references to technology are made alongside and increasingly intertwined with extremist ideology. I think this highlights an important point about the study of online extremism here, is that everyone may arrive into the community under dissimilar circumstances, right? There are many pathways to radicalization. However, their interaction while using the same technologies, it does afford a relatively stable environment to entangle themselves in the community. For instance, we saw users again discussing in great detail and at length these imaginary scenarios, simulating how do figures within our ideology think and behave in relationship to the same technologies that we use, even the same technologies that they use to express those ideas. So this, to me, seems to merge personal history with present deficits within this much broader context that Kramer called the post-digital era. And the post-digital era essentially means a challenge to the assumptions underlying this great information age, where we once saw the internet as being a predominantly emancipatory force. It was going to provide us with all the freedom and flexibility and belief that we needed to actualize world peace, and we could all get along with each other, and it was all about human flourishing and so forth. But now we seem to be in this post-digital era where we're slowly realizing that perhaps this isn't the case, and perhaps there's biases here that we need to challenge and appreciate when undertaking research in the online space. An incel user asked of another, do you think that you'd get laid if it wasn't for advancements in technology? So just before I move to the implications for practitioners, and again, I would really enjoy hearing your reflections and your questions on that. And just before we get there, there does seem to be three perspectives here that I'd like to highlight that I think have emerged both out of this most recent piece of research as well as others employing the ecological approach. And that is first, the importance of examining actual men and boys and their developmental experiences in relationship to boyhood and adolescence and adulthood, masculinity, and their biological development all the while. The second is moving beyond denunciatory terms, right? How do we examine, as Grace Sharkey termed it, the arrested development of these communities and these individuals, right? What are the actual disadvantages here? And how can we, in an empirical and methodologically rigorous manner, come to disassociate between the influences of this post-digital age, and how does it come to shape the enculturation of these communities that we are so concerned about? And the other one is really the importance of bringing together alternative practitioner perspectives with this ecological perspective, right? How do we reach out to and bring into the fold other people who could help us understand these communities from an ecological perspectives? And these could be consultants from men and masculinities studies, or clinical social workers and psychologists that specialize in socio-technical systems generally, or in social media addiction in particular. And how could they come to work alongside counter-violent extremist specialists? Right. So while I'm not a practitioner myself, I'm extremely fortunate to be involved in conversations and connected with counter-violent extremism experts who do their best to update me on what to do in this kind of context. And I'm led to believe that because CVE programs deal with a very specific type of criminal behavior, right? It's ideologically driven violence. It's understandable why ideology is placed at the center, or often placed at the center, to bring about change. And this is, of course, not uniform across divisions and groups dedicated to CVE. There was a fabulous presentation given recently on this same AVERT platform, a team from South Australia. I encourage anyone to go back and watch that because it does seem to employ characteristics of the ecological approach, you might say. And for those who are predominantly preoccupied with making psychological or ideological change with their clients, if you are faced with someone who was referred to you for their participation in concerning online communities, you may feel the tendency to view their progress again through the lens of ideology. And I'm told this can leave certain practitioners quite perplexed as to what to do with their client and what is the suitable intervention, right? What's the protocol? How do we tailor it to this person? And does this person even present a suitable level of risk in order to mobilize the resources that we have? And considering that there does seem to be, few suitably qualified practitioners that have a personal history as being a part of these communities, as well as those who are willing to not just become involved in CVE, but to help tackle these nuanced ideological discussions and support someone's social integration back into society. I mean, these resources and the particular people that we're interested in bringing into the fold can seem quite limited or scarce. And in this way, this focus on framing the problem as predominantly about ideology in a very practical sense may not be the most effective way for developing useful interventions. Ecological thinking, on the other hand, could concentrate us and our attention on the specific modes of contact between the person that is referred, the technologies that they use, and the ideologies that influence them. For example, rather than broadly categorizing the environments in reference to, it being either online or offline, we could tailor interventions accordingly or according to the exact ways that an extremist interacts with specific features in their environment, and why is it that these modes facilitate their relationship to the ideologies that we are most concerned about. Again, this is not to say that ideology is not important, and I understand that and appreciate that ideology is not just a critical intellectual component of violent extremism, but a judicial one. In saying that, I also think it's important to recognize that extremist ideologies are embedded and increasingly shaped by networks of platforms and devices, communities and their physical surroundings, as well as the companies who designed and helped to deploy those platforms and devices. In fact, I see this as a really valuable opportunity for practitioners to learn strategies that have been developed in other behavior change fields, such as cognitive behavioral therapy for internet addiction, or talk therapy with those who specialize in men and masculinities, or social media addiction, or development studies generally. So again, ideology does play a vital role, and incorporating that role with alternative practices into a practitioner's strategy may provide a really useful or practical first step, right? Approaching a client to talk about their use of social media as it relates to extremism or the reasons why they were referred might be arguably an easier conversation to have, rather than one that focuses on solely changing their belief system from the outset. Focusing on behavior change in this way would also provide an opportunity to design in very measurable measures of progress and be able to benchmark a client's progress over time relative to, say, practices of social media disengagement, or how long has it been since they used their smartphone to access any of the social media spaces that we're concerned about, or simply trying to understand, right, well, what is the prevalence and association of these technologies in their life. The other thing that this would do would open up the door to other practitioners and other practitioner communities to step in and contribute to our collective effort, right? It would open up the pool of potential practitioners that could contribute. And I think that this makes sense, right? If a client regularly uses technology to interact with concerning content, trying to change their relationship to the technology, right, their mode of connection, may render more opportunities for them to not just experience disillusionment, but to develop a more pluralist attitude towards their lives and that of the community for which they they once hold dear. If a client regularly uses social media to interact with an extremist group or a particular leader, particularly those who we know try to induce feelings of exclusion and betrayal and threat and uncertainty and a sense of urgency to do something, right? These technologies will continue to support their identity templates, particularly those that are conducive to this extreme sense of self, and worse yet, may even connect them to other people that can reinforce this. So aside from the pressure of being exposed to extremist content and their communities, we are, starting to acknowledge that extensive or abusive use of these social networking technologies, it does add another layer of stress on the client's mental health. It takes resources away from their cognition and their capacity for collective sense making. And I see this as, again, just another strain on efforts to reintegrate them socially, let alone reorientate their worldview. So getting down to the nuts and bolts of how to do this in a conversation with yourself or potentially with a client, and please, rearrange the phrasing as you so wish. But these are the kinds of questions that I ask of myself of late is, what are the modes of interaction here that are facilitating a person's connection to and interaction with and enculturation of extremist ideology? And also, what are the modes of inclination, right? Why is it that this person specifically feels susceptible to not just the ideology, but to the technologies that enable them to appreciate and come to incorporate that extremist ideology into their identity and their behavior and so forth? And again, just a broader question as to why these two things are coming together, right? If ecology helps us to think about the systematic interaction between organisms and their environments, why is it that the modes of interaction and the modes of inclination are coming together? And what are the main developmental consequences of this over time? And as we learn to mitigate the negative impact of these technologies in society generally, I can envision a future where these hard-earned lessons are more so effectively integrated into counter-violent extremism programs. And because of this, I and others would argue that social media technologies really wield a bidirectional influence and a kind of developmental impact on violent extremists, right? It not only facilitates an extremist's intention to action their beliefs, but it simultaneously shapes their intentions and molds their beliefs at the same time. I think that ecosystems has enormous theoretical and methodological and increasingly practical potential here. However, it's important to note that all the while, and this is something that continues to be echoed throughout the literature, among other disciplines and fields of study who, in their best efforts to accommodate ecology into their own research, have said it's important not to restrict the way that we use ecosystems, nor dilute it such that it loses relevance to either science or management. Of course, I mean, this conversation and the findings therein could not happen without the contribution of various colleagues for whom I am tremendously fortunate enough to collaborate with and who have, greatly shaped my approach here. And I really look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Well, Jade, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I think your research is incredibly important and so interesting and really helps expand our understanding. I thought the finding from your incel study about the centrality of hardware and software is so interesting, given that we so often focus on intervening when it comes to narratives, ideologies, psychosocial needs, or even networks of actors. So like we said, this is the time for audience Q&A. So please put any of your questions in the Q&A function and we'll be sure to get to them. But while we're waiting for folks to to think of some questions and put them in there. I've got a few of my own that have come to my mind after listening your presentation. I suppose first I'll ask you. You know, you highlighted your case study of you know, the incel ecology and that movement. I'm wondering if you could share kind of what lessons you learned through that case study, and perhaps some questions that have come up from that case study that you can take with you for studying other online communities or ideologies.
It's a good question. There are at least three that I can think of. One is I found when relaying the results of this study to other colleagues, they started to push around my intuition around this idea that the environments that incels and other individuals are interacting with are relatively stable. And for me, this shifts the focus away from uniform agents that have unique adaptive strategies, and this produces a collective outcome that we don't want. And it moves us more towards seeing these communities as composed of unique people who are interacting within uniform uniform environments that produce collective outcomes. And I think that subtle shift in focus toward appreciating the environment as intentionally designed to provide individuals with a reasonably stable pathway by which they can communicate and also understand the communications of others, I think also shifts the focus away from expressions of ideologies as being, you know, those unique adaptive strategies that we're trying to mitigate and manage because they just change all the time. And it becomes somewhat of a Sisyphean task in order to continue to catch up to that, I believe. The other one is ideological conventions or interventions that are predicated on changing belief systems. I struggle to see the ways that they resemble these socio-technical relationships, specifically how ideology is shaped by those environments in which they're expressed and how interventions can account for that. Hence, some of the recommendations that were presented here. And the third one I was thinking of was if we take ideology to be an important but accompanying component to this much broader context in which extremist communities are enculturated in, and there's many terms for this. I mean, people have called it the social media ecology, and outside of ecosystems terms, they've used the attention economy, or they've used the extreme technological milieu, which I've used of late. I think it really does orientate us around not just changes in ideology, but changes to the environments in which those ideologies are expressed and the ways in which it challenges our assumptions here, but also I think provides us with some really valuable opportunities to bring into the fold people who I think have spent a lot more time thinking about how digital media technology has changed and the way that's changed us over time.
Two things from your responses jump to mind. One is that we've been talking a lot about the fluidity of late of ideologies, or that picking and choosing of particular elements. And so it seems that this ecosystems approach and in your answer might help us to kind of unpack some of why that's happening. And certainly that your last point around bringing in other disciplines, particularly media and internet studies, and thinking in the CVE space and in the terrorism research space is quite apt. And that brings me to another question, because you talked about in the end of your presentation about how the ecosystems concept highlights how either shifting or changing an individual's relationship with a particular technology can be a powerful intervention. But it seems that if we want to get to the heart of the issue as a society around the affordances of technology, it needs to come around the regulation of hardware, software, and the economies in which they operate in. And that seems to sit so far outside of the CVE national security space and programs and regulations. So do you think then that any CVE interventions, even though they may have a potential individual impact, is swimming against a much bigger tide without this broader ecosystem, if you will, of regulation?
Absolutely. It's a considerable concern of mine that there is a substantial gap between the life of a practitioner and that of a policymaker, who are each concerned about the way that specific technologies are designed and deployed to get people to use that product more in such a way that produces more harm than good. And the concern is really in that there's not a lot of conversation between them. And the third, you know, the third elephant in the room is social media companies and other technology companies responsible for those designs and the ways in which they're deployed in society. I should note that, ecosystems here may not necessarily be effective in prefacing that kind of conversation between policymakers and practitioners, right? Ecosystems can be used as a really powerful rhetorical tool, and it can elicit inaccurate impressions about how to proceed going forward with that conversation. And it can also arouse suspicion that it's, it's making a comment on, the organic or deterministic nature by which extremism and violence emerges from this situation. And with that, with that flag planted from the outset, and I encourage us all to be aware of it, I see the suggestions to practitioners as being an immediate insight that I can provide in order to upskill or hopefully increase the effectiveness by which individuals disengage and make their way away from these ideologies in those communities. There's a whole nother conversation there about how do we incorporate existing debates about the role of, say, safety by design in producing or ameliorating existing products. And this is not just within the social media space, but increasingly within gaming spaces as well. Also, conversations around the role that social media companies and their constituents have in providing intermediary access to those things that are fundamental to operating within society, right? It really wasn't that long ago when, you didn't need these platforms to have friends or to draw meaningful relationships or to have purpose that was not just benign, but constructive and sustainable, and was tied to a future society that we could all, hold hands and move towards. But unfortunately, and in some ways, we now have to work retrospectively to help us realize, both with ourselves and potentially with our clients, that this was not always the case, and it doesn't have to be the case in the future. There are other ways. So for me, trying to connect practitioners and policymakers is a worthwhile, venture, and I enjoy trying to bring those people together. I see providing insights to practitioners as being an immediate way that I can contribute to that. And I understand that the machinery of policy does move at a slower pace, and that is something that is ongoing. And I'm happy to see that other conversations that are more developed in this space, like human-computer interaction studies and safety by design and all that, they're also now being incorporated into that machinery. So I'm quite hopeful that these two parties can be further brought together, and companies themselves can be introduced into that in a way that doesn't make them feel threatened and feels more like a collaboration and something that is actually within their best interest as well. Oh, sorry, Lydia, I think you might be muted.
I'm on mute, excuse me, everyone. We've had another great question that's come in, which is that um, can this ecosystems approach help us explain offline dynamics of violent extremism as well? Or is it only connected to these online ecosystems that you mentioned?
Sure, I think it definitely can. There is one assumption here that I have, which seems to be increasingly brought out within the literature, and that is the distinction between online and offline dynamics is rapidly dissolving. And the reality of cybernetics is really omnipresent and has pressure on us all in many different ways. For instance, even though someone may be interacting online, contributing something that is of great concern, they still have a body attached, to those, bits of communication online, and that body is always interacting in offline space. And even if they're not participating in that online community, they are, as I'm sure we all are very cognizant as to where our devices are at all times, and in fact, most of, if not all of your devices are probably within arm's length now. And something that has given me, great insight into this relationship between online and offline dynamics is actually in sort of developmental neuroscience, right? In what ways do participation in online forums extend far beyond the online space? Because this is where I think hardware provides a really important sort of intermediary component between online communications and the effects offline, providing that very physical connection, right, between someone, their thoughts and their feelings, and the way that's translated into online expression and online ideology. So there's that. The other thing is, whenever someone contributes to an online space, that contribution is not forgotten, and it isn't isolated to that one expression, right? If someone contributes to a post, right, they leave a comment on a Facebook post, for instance, they know that they've done that, and other people within that community can recognize that they've done that, and that then becomes a timestamp in memory for both that person and that community that endures beyond the point in which they originally posted it. And so you could understandably see that timestamp as contributing to, later experiences and later kinds of behavior, right? It's not just about that one post. It's about that one post in context to all the things that that person did on their mobile phone in that 1 hour or that 3 hours or that 9 hours that they spent on their phone, which unfortunately is happening, more and more. And then that is also nestled within a larger context, right? What did that person also do in the rest of their day? And what did their community do, having seen their contributions, and so on and so forth? And you can kind of see where ecosystems provides a clearer view of how different contexts are nestled within one another. And the distinction between online and offline is, quickly overcome in this way. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, certainly that dichotomy between online and offline, we need to really rethink that space. I mean, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you, Jade, for this. I've got lots more questions, but unfortunately we've come to time. So I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Mr. Jade Hutchinson for this terrific presentation. It's really expanded my thinking and hopefully yours too. It'll be made available on the website as a recording for you to reference and view later. And please also stay tuned for news about our upcoming webinar, which will be later on in the month, and where we're going to be launching a new Routledge Handbook of Radicalization and Countering Radicalization. And we'll have a number of terrific and esteemed colleagues out of Australia and in the UK who will be joining us for that. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully, we'll be able to see you all next time. And thank you again.
No worries. Thank you, Lydia.